The little boy had soot in his hair and blood on one sleeve, but the woman holding him looked more frightened by the men outside than by the fire behind her. They called her a kidnapper. They swore the child belonged to a wealthy family in town. Yet when she tried to hand him over, he clung to her coat and began to shake. A burned envelope slipped from her pocket. Before anyone reached it, hoofbeats came in dark smoke. Caleb Hart swung down from his horse before the animal had fully stopped. Smoke drifted low across the frozen ground, carrying the bitter smell of wet timber and burned paper. What remained of the Ash Creek Schoolhouse stood black against the pale morning. One wall collapsed, the roof sagging inward, ash moving over the snow like gray dust. At the edge of the ruins, Mara Ellison stood with a boy pressed behind her. She looked too young to carry the exhaustion written across her face. At 27, Mara had the hollow eyes of someone who had spent too many nights expecting a door to break open. Soot covered her dress. One sleeve was burned through near the wrist, and the skin beneath it had turned red and raw. Still, she kept herself between the child and the men gathered near the road. Caleb noticed that before he noticed anything else. Harlan Voss stood among those men in a clean wool coat, untouched by smoke. He was already telling the deputy what had happened, shaping the morning into something simple enough for the town to believe. A strange woman had taken the boy. The schoolhouse had burned. Mara had been found inside. The conclusion had arrived before the truth. Caleb moved closer without joining either side. He had learned long ago that frightened people often revealed more through movement than words. Mara did not look toward the open road. She did not measure the distance to his horse. She did not search for an escape. She watched only the boy. Noah's face was streaked with soot, and each breath came shallow and uneven. One small hand clutched the back of Mara's dress. The other remained closed tightly against his chest. When Harlan stepped forward, Noah changed. His shoulders locked. His breathing quickened. He pressed himself harder against Mara and turned his face away as if the sight of the cattlemen frightened him more than the smoking ruins behind them. Caleb saw Mara feel it too. She shifted one step, placing her burned arm across the boy without hesitation. Near her boots lay a scorched leather satchel. A brass key showed briefly beneath the torn edge of her coat before disappearing again. Caleb caught only a glimpse, but the shape stamped into its head stopped him. It looked like the old Cedar Ridge mark, a mark his family had not used in years. Harlan reached toward Noah. The boy recoiled so violently that his heel slipped in the ash. Caleb caught him before he fell. For one startled second, Noah stared at the faded brand stitched into Caleb's winter coat. Then his closed hand opened. A blackened silver button rested in his palm. It carried the same mark. By the time Sheriff Daniel Pike cleared the back room of his office, Mara Ellison had begun to shake from the cold. She hid it by folding her burned hand beneath the other. Noah sat beside her with a blanket around his shoulders, watching the door each time boots crossed the floor outside. Caleb remained near the window, silent, giving both of them space while Harlan Voss waited in the front room with the confidence of a man accustomed to being believed. Mara gave the sheriff only what she could prove. Her husband, Thomas Ellison, had worked as a county records clerk and had spent years copying deeds, livestock transfers, guardianship papers, and tax ledgers. Mara had often helped him after dark, checking columns and organizing documents when his eyesight grew tired. 6 months earlier, Thomas had died after his horse went over a rocky embankment outside Red Willow. Within days of his burial, rumors began. Money was said to be missing from county accounts. Several papers Thomas had handled could no longer be found. Harlan had been among the first men to suggest that Thomas had stolen records before his death, and that Mara knew where they were hidden. No formal charge had ever proved it, but proof mattered less than reputation in a small town. The room Mara rented was taken from her. Work disappeared. Women who once greeted her outside church began crossing the street. She had survived by sewing, cleaning, and copying letters for people willing to pay without asking questions. Mara did not ask Pike to feel sorry for her. She placed the scorched satchel on his desk and allowed him to examine everything that had survived the fire. If there was something stolen inside, he could find it himself. Her only request was that Noah not be handed to Harlan until the boy could breathe properly, and the events at the schoolhouse were examined. That was when the story became harder to dismiss. Noah was not Mara's son. She had known him only as a quiet pupil who sometimes remained near the school after the other children left. The evening before the fire, A folded note had been pushed beneath the door of the room where Mara was staying. It claimed Thomas had hidden something for her inside Ash Creek Schoolhouse and warned that the building would be locked after midnight. Mara had gone because Thomas had once told her that if anything happened to him, unfinished numbers would matter more than unfinished words. She found Noah inside. The boy would not explain why he was there. Before Mara could search the room, smoke began pushing beneath an interior door. Within minutes, flames climbed the wall. She could have escaped alone through a side window. Instead, she went back for Noah and carried him through the collapsing hallway. Harlan's papers complicated everything. He held a document naming him Noah's legal guardian and insisted the boy had been taken without permission. Pike studied it while Mara watched the dates rather than the signatures. One certification line appeared darker than the rest, and the ink had bled differently into the paper. She did not accuse anyone. She simply pointed out that the document deserved closer examination. Caleb noticed how carefully she spoke. Mara never claimed more than she knew. Pike could not arrest her on rumor, but he could not allow her to vanish while the fire and guardianship were being investigated. Caleb offered the simplest solution. Cedar Ridge lay within Pike's jurisdiction, and the sheriff had known Caleb long enough to trust that he would not hide anyone from the law. Mara accepted only after making it clear she would work for every meal and every night beneath his roof. The ride out of Red Willow passed beneath a colorless sky. Noah sat wrapped in Caleb's spare coat while Mara watched the road behind them less often than she watched the boy. Near sunset, the cedar posts of the ranch gate rose ahead. A weathered mark had been burned into the crossbeam years before. The moment Noah saw it, his whole body went still. His hand slipped into his pocket and closed around the silver button. Cedar Ridge looked smaller than Mara had imagined from the road, but it carried the quiet strength of a place built to survive hard winters. The main house stood beneath a line of dark pines, its porch weathered silver by years of snow and sun. Beyond it stretched the barn, corrals, a smokehouse, and miles of pasture fading into the cold Wyoming dusk. Caleb did not treat Mara like a guest, but he did not treat her like a burden either. He showed her the spare room at the back of the house, left folded clothes on the bed, and set food on the kitchen table without watching to see how quickly she ate. He gave Noah a blanket and allowed the boy to remain beside Mara until his breathing settled. Nothing in Caleb's manner suggested that kindness gave him the right to demand explanations. That restraint unsettled Mara more than suspicion would have. She had learned how to defend herself against accusations. She had forgotten how to respond when no accusation came. The next morning, she asked for work. Caleb led her into a narrow office beside the kitchen where ledgers were stacked beneath a dusty window. Cedar Ridge had no full-time bookkeeper. One of the older ranch hands usually recorded purchases, but illness had kept him away for weeks. Caleb needed invoices sorted, feed orders matched with receipts, and several months of supply entries copied cleanly. It was ordinary work. Mara was grateful for that. She spent the morning arranging papers by date while Noah sat near the stove drawing horses on scraps of discarded account sheets. Within an hour, the familiar columns steadied her nerves. Numbers did not whisper behind her back. Ink did not change its story, because a wealthy man entered the room. Outside, Caleb worked with the horses. Noah eventually drifted toward the barn door. Mara followed at a distance, ready to call him back. But Caleb had already noticed the boy. He brought forward an old sorrel mare gentle enough to stand half asleep in the cold and showed Noah, without forcing him closer, how to let the horse smell his hand first. For the first time since the fire, Noah smiled. The sight stopped Mara in the doorway. Caleb never looked toward her for approval. He simply remained beside the boy until fear gave way to curiosity. That evening, after Noah fell asleep, Mara brought the scorched satchel into her room. Fire had eaten through one corner, but several things remained. Thomas's damaged notes were wrapped in cloth. A half-burned envelope carried only fragments of an address. Beneath them lay the brass key she had found among the papers at the schoolhouse. Mara turned it beneath the lamplight. The mark stamped into its head matched the symbol over Cedar Ridge's gate. She remembered Caleb mentioning that the old ranch mark had once appeared on personal tools and tack belonging to his family. He had also spoken briefly of his younger brother, Matthew Hart, who had been gone for years. Mara's hand tightened around the key. She could have taken it to Caleb immediately. Instead, fear stopped her. For months, every unusual object connected to Thomas had been used as another reason to call her dishonest. Walking into Caleb's room with a key bearing his family mark could destroy the first fragile safety she and Noah had found. She returned it to the satchel. When she turned around, Noah was awake. The boy stood silently beside the bed, his small fist closed around something. He crossed the room and placed the black and silver button on the table beside the brass key. Under the lamplight, Mara finally saw both marks clearly. They were identical. By sunrise, Mara had placed the brass key and the silver button inside a folded handkerchief at the back of the desk drawer. She was not ready to show Caleb what she had found. Not yet. But the matching marks changed the way she looked at every paper in the Cedar Ridge office. What had seemed like ordinary ranch bookkeeping now felt connected to something older. She began with the feed invoices. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Cedar Ridge bought grain, salt, lamp oil, fencing wire, veterinary supplies, and winter feed like every other ranch in the territory. But when Mara placed 3 years of receipts beside one another, a pattern emerged. Transportation charges rose every few months, even when the amount of freight stayed nearly the same. The increases always came through one company, Voss Freight and Stock. Mara checked again before saying anything. Thomas had taught her never to accuse a man when a column could still be wrong. She compared dates, wagon loads, and delivery marks. Then she found 2 invoices for the same shipment, both paid from Cedar Ridge accounts. Caleb came in from the north pasture and found the office floor covered with paper. Mara showed him the duplicate charges without embellishment. She explained that 1 mistake meant little. 6 mistakes in the same direction meant someone should start asking questions. Caleb did not dismiss her. He brought down older ledgers from a shelf Mara had not yet opened. That was when the pattern became harder to ignore. Several payments carried signatures supposedly written by different ranch employees, yet the final strokes were almost identical. One signature appeared on a document dated during a week Caleb knew the man had been in Cheyenne buying breeding stock. Mara asked for everything connected to Matthew Hart. Caleb hesitated before unlocking an old cabinet. Matthew had once kept a small share of Cedar Ridge records there before leaving Wyoming. Most of the drawer was empty. A few letters remained, along with a faded photograph and a handwritten livestock list folded between 2 tax notices. Mara noticed the photograph first. Matthew stood beside a young woman in a light summer dress. The image was badly faded, but something at the woman's throat still caught the light. A narrow chain held a small silver ornament that looked disturbingly similar to Noah's button. Caleb had never seen her. Mara turned instead to the letters. One of Matthew's pages contained a sentence that mattered more than all the rest. He had written that whatever happened between him and his family, he would never sell his share of Cedar Ridge to an outsider. Yet another document in the cabinet claimed he had done exactly that. The transfer named Harlan Voss. Mara compared the date with Matthew's letters and Thomas's damaged notes. Something was wrong. The paperwork claimed Matthew had signed away his interest while traveling near Red Willow, but a letter written during the same period had been posted hundreds of miles away. Then Mara examined the signature. It was too careful. Real signatures changed with speed, fatigue, bad pens, and uneven tables. This one looked copied from something else, each curve placed as though the writer had been afraid to make a mistake. For the first time, Caleb understood why Thomas Ellison might have died with unfinished records hidden from powerful men. And Mara understood something worse. The fire at Ash Creek might not have been meant to destroy a schoolhouse. It might have been meant to destroy whatever Thomas had left behind. If you think Mara has earned Caleb's trust by following the evidence instead of making accusations, share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the smallest detail is the one powerful people hope no one will notice. Late that afternoon, Mara compared the transfer document with an old county notice. She stopped breathing for a moment. The date on Matthew's supposed transfer came after a record that placed him far from Red Willow. If both documents were genuine, Matthew Hart could not have signed them both. The discovery in Matthew Hart's records changed the atmosphere at Cedar Ridge. Mara no longer looked at the ranch books as a collection of careless mistakes. She treated them as a trail, and every trail had to lead somewhere. She began with the cattle. For 3 mornings, Mara sat beside the office window with shipping receipts spread across the desk, while Caleb and the ranch hands counted the herd in the lower pasture. She compared every animal recorded as sold, moved, injured, or lost against the freight charges Cedar Ridge had paid. By the 4th afternoon, she found the first impossible shipment. Cedar Ridge had been charged for transporting 43 head of cattle to the rail depot, during a week when Caleb's ranch journal showed no cattle leaving the property. 2 months later, another payment appeared for 31 head, then 28 more. The invoices were all issued through Voss Freight and Stock. Caleb checked the ranch journals himself. The numbers did not change. Someone had been billing Cedar Ridge for cattle that were never shipped. But Mara noticed something worse. The herd was still smaller than it should have been. She asked Caleb to compare the spring calf count with the animals now grazing near the north fence. Nearly 24 young cattle were missing beyond what sickness or ordinary loss could explain. The north pasture bordered land controlled by Harlan Voss. Mara refused to accuse him without proof. Instead, she proposed a simple test. Caleb selected 12 calves and placed a small hidden notch inside each leather identification strap, a mark invisible from several feet away. The ranch hands moved those animals into the northern grazing section and changed nothing else about their routine. 3 nights passed. On the 4th morning, 2 calves were gone. Caleb followed the fence line and found no broken rails, no storm damage, and no tracks suggesting frightened animals had wandered away. The only fresh marks came from horses and a narrow livestock wagon near an old service gate. Mara returned to the invoices. A Voss shipment was scheduled to leave the Red Willow rail depot that afternoon. Caleb rode there with Sheriff Pike. Mara remained at Cedar Ridge with Noah, but the answer came back before sunset. Among Harlan's cattle waiting beside the rail cars were both missing calves. The hidden notches were still inside their straps. Caleb did not start a fight. He did not need to. Sheriff Pike stopped the shipment, recorded the markings, questioned the depot workers, and returned the animals to Cedar Ridge while the ownership dispute was investigated. For the first time, Harlan Voss had been forced to answer a question instead of deciding what everyone else should believe. The effect on Cedar Ridge was immediate. Mara calculated how much the ranch had lost through false freight charges and disappearing cattle. The amount was large enough to explain why Caleb had been considering selling part of the herd before winter despite several good seasons. Stopping the losses meant he no longer had to make that sale. The woman Red Willow had treated as a burden had saved Cedar Ridge thousands of dollars without firing a weapon, raising her voice, or asking anyone to trust her blindly. She had simply followed the numbers. Caleb began leaving important ranch decisions on her desk before acting on them. Feed purchases, shipping schedules, winter estimates. He no longer asked whether she understood the work. He asked what she thought. Noah noticed the change, too. He began sitting beside Mara in the evenings, sorting harmless receipts into piles, while she taught him to add small columns of figures. Some nights, Caleb returned from the barn and found the two of them bent over the desk beneath the lamplight. The house no longer felt as empty as it had before the schoolhouse burned. But Mara knew the stolen calves were only part of the story. While reviewing Matthew's old handwritten livestock list, she found a series of markings beside certain cattle transfers. The same code appeared years later on invoices belonging to Voss Freight and Stock. The connection had existed while Matthew was still alive. Mara searched until midnight. Near the bottom of an older account book, she finally found a payment large enough to make her stop. Money had been withdrawn from an account bearing Matthew Hart's name. The recipient was Harlan Voss, and the transaction had been recorded after the date everyone in Red Willow believed Matthew Hart was already dead. Winter began settling over Cedar Ridge in small, quiet ways. Frost stayed longer on the fence rails each morning. The horses breathed white clouds into the dawn, and the kitchen windows turned silver around the edges before the stove warmed the house. Mara noticed another change, too. A cup of coffee began appearing beside the ledgers before she came downstairs. Caleb never mentioned it. He simply rose earlier, poured 2 cups instead of 1, and left hers near the place where she worked. Mara never thanked him aloud. She drank it while checking freight records, and each morning the small kindness felt less like charity and more like something she had almost forgotten how to accept. In return, Caleb found his winter coat hanging beside the stove one evening with the torn shoulder carefully mended. Mara had matched the old thread so closely that the repair was nearly invisible. Neither of them spoke about that either. Noah slowly changed between them. The boy still woke some nights frightened by smoke he could no longer see, but daylight brought him closer to the ranch. Caleb let him brush the old sorrel mare and taught him how to tighten a saddle without frightening the horse. He never pushed Noah onto its back. He waited until the boy asked through his actions, standing beside the mounting block longer each morning. The first time Noah finally sat in the saddle, Mara watched from the barn doorway. Caleb kept one hand near the boy's boot while leading the mare in a slow circle. Noah's fear loosened into concentration, then into a smile so sudden that Mara had to look away for a moment. She had spent months thinking safety meant a locked door. At Cedar Ridge, she was beginning to understand that sometimes it meant knowing no one would force you through one. Later that week, a length of fencing wire tore through Caleb's glove while he repaired a gate before the weather changed. He returned to the kitchen with blood running across his palm. Mara cleaned the cut and wrapped it carefully. Caleb sat still while she worked. He did not make light of the injury or pull away from her touch. Mara was more aware of that quiet trust than she wanted to be. His hand was rough from reins, rope, cold iron, and years of labor. Yet he held it completely still beneath hers. For one brief moment, the ranch office, Harlan Voss, and the burned schoolhouse seemed very far away. Mara finished the bandage and returned to the ledgers. That night, rain struck the barn roof in heavy waves before turning to sleet. Mara went outside to make sure the office papers stored near the tack room were protected from a leak. Caleb was already there, moving a crate beneath the dry side of the loft. When the work was finished, neither hurried back to the house. They remained beneath the barn roof while rain hammered the boards above them. Mara realized she was no longer measuring every silence for danger. Caleb did not press her about Thomas, Harlan, or the papers she had hidden for months. His patience left room for her to decide what belonged to the past and what she was ready to carry into the present. That was what frightened her most. She was beginning to imagine staying. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because Cedar Ridge had started to feel like a place where her usefulness was not the price of being treated with dignity. Caleb, meanwhile, began speaking more often about Matthew. Years earlier, the brothers had argued after Matthew fell in love with a woman whose family Caleb did not trust. Matthew left Cedar Ridge angry, and Caleb believed for years that pride had stolen the last chance to repair what stood between them. One night, Noah fell asleep at the kitchen table while Mara sorted old correspondence. Caleb lifted the boy and carried him to the spare room. As Mara pulled the blanket over Noah, the child murmured a name through his sleep. Lydia. Mara froze. Caleb did too. The name belonged to the young woman standing beside Matthew in the faded photograph. And Caleb remembered something he had not thought about in years. Matthew had once written that the woman he intended to marry was named Lydia Voss. By morning, Mara was ready to ask what that name meant. She never got the chance. A line of riders appeared beyond the Cedar Ridge gate. Harlan Voss rode at the front. Beside him was a lawyer carrying a leather document case. The riders stopped outside the Cedar Ridge gate before the morning frost had melted from the grass. Harlan Voss dismounted first. His lawyer followed with a leather document case tucked beneath one arm, while Sheriff Pike rode several yards behind them with the uneasy look of a man who had already been told only one side of the story. Mara stood on the porch with Noah behind her. Caleb walked past them and stopped inside the gate. He carried no rifle. That seemed to bother Harlan more than a weapon would have. The lawyer opened his case and produced a guardianship order naming Harlan as Noah's lawful guardian. A second paper accused Mara of removing the boy without permission and described Caleb as a man knowingly interfering with the return of a minor. There was more. If Cedar Ridge continued sheltering Noah, Harlan intended to ask the county court to place a temporary hold on disputed ranch property until the boy's guardianship and any related inheritance claims were settled. The threat was clear. Caleb could protect Mara and risk the ranch, or protect the ranch by surrendering the child. Harlan expected the choice to frighten him. Instead, Caleb asked Sheriff Pike to examine every document before anyone crossed the gate. Mara watched Harlan while Pike read. The cattleman looked almost comfortable when speaking about her. He reminded the sheriff that Thomas Ellison had died beneath suspicion. He suggested Mara had stolen county records, taken Noah, and now attached herself to a rancher whose property might benefit from whatever papers she carried. Months earlier, those accusations would have made Mara lower her eyes. This time, she stepped forward. She did not defend her reputation. She asked to see the guardianship order. Pike handed it to her. Mara read slowly, beginning with the date, then the witness certification, then the county seal pressed near the bottom. She had copied hundreds of official papers beside Thomas. She remembered when Red Willow changed the design of its certification mark because the previous stamp had cracked along the outer ring. The document claimed to have been certified 2 years before that change. But the newer seal was on the page. Mara checked it again. The paper could not be what Harlan claimed it was. Sheriff Pike's expression changed when she explained the discrepancy. He did not declare the order false, but he folded it carefully and said the county clerk would compare it against the original record before Noah went anywhere. For the first time that morning, Harlan lost some of his calm. He turned toward the boy. Noah had moved beside Caleb now, one hand wrapped around the rancher's coat. The silver button hung from a cord Mara had tied around his neck so it would not be lost again. Harlan saw it. His face hardened, only for a moment, but Mara noticed. So did Caleb. The object meant something to him. Harlan recovered quickly and warned that Cedar Ridge was already weak enough after years of losses. Winter was approaching. Banks became impatient. Freight contracts could disappear. Buyers could choose other cattle. A ranch did not need to burn to be destroyed. Caleb remained where he stood. He would obey a lawful order when Pike proved it lawful. Until then, Noah would not be dragged through the gate while frightened and injured simply because the richest man in Red Willow demanded it. No one raised a weapon. No one needed to. The balance between the two men had changed because Harlan had arrived expecting obedience and found questions instead. Mara felt something change inside her as well. Caleb was not protecting her by speaking over her. He had allowed her to examine the papers. He had trusted her knowledge in front of the sheriff, the lawyer, and the man who had spent months teaching Red Willow not to believe her. If you were standing at that gate, would you have risked your ranch to protect Mara and Noah until the truth was known? Share your answer in the comments, and send this story to someone who still believes doing the right thing matters when it costs something. Sheriff Pike kept the guardianship order and told Harlan no one would remove Noah until the county records were checked. Harlan mounted his horse. Then he looked back at the child. This time he did not call him Noah. He called him Noah Matthew Hart. Caleb went completely still. Mara turned toward him, and Harlan rode away, knowing he had just spoken the one name he had been trying hardest to hide. For several minutes after Harlan disappeared down the road, no one at Cedar Ridge moved. The name he had spoken remained heavier than the morning cold. Noah Matthew Hart. Caleb stood near the gate, with one hand resting against the cedar post. Mara had never seen him look uncertain before. Anger would have been easier to understand. Instead, there was something quieter in his face, something closer to grief reopening after years of being forced shut. Noah stayed beside him. Caleb did not ask the boy questions. He did not demand to know why Harlan had used his family name. He simply walked back to the house and waited until Noah was inside before turning to Mara. Mara expected him to tell her what they would do next. Instead, Caleb gave her a choice. If she wanted to leave Cedar Ridge before Harlan returned with stronger papers, Caleb would take her anywhere, she asked. He would arrange a wagon to Cheyenne, pay for a train ticket, or bring her to someone Sheriff Pike trusted. He would not let gratitude become another kind of cage. Mara understood what he was offering. Freedom. For months, she had dreamed of it. Yet the thought of leaving now felt different from the thought of escaping Red Willow. If she disappeared, Harlan would still control the story. Noah would still be vulnerable. Thomas would remain remembered as a thief, and whatever Matthew Hart had tried to protect would stay buried. Mara chose to remain. Not for Caleb. Not yet. She stayed because running would surrender the truth to the man most afraid of it. That afternoon, Caleb, Mara, and Noah rode into Red Willow with Sheriff Pike. Mara carried the guardianship order, the duplicate freight invoices, Matthew's letters, and Thomas's burned notes. Pike examined each document again before taking them to an older man living behind the abandoned livery stable. His name was Eli Mercer. Years earlier, Eli had worked horses for Harlan Voss. At first, he claimed to remember nothing. Then Noah entered the room. The old man's eyes dropped to the silver button hanging from the cord around the boy's neck. His face changed. Eli had seen buttons like that before. Matthew Hart had worn them on a dark riding coat in the years when he traveled between Cedar Ridge and the Voss property. They had been made specially for him, stamped with the old family mark. Caleb asked about Lydia. Eli looked toward the window before answering. Lydia Voss had loved Matthew Hart. Harlan had forbidden the match, but the two had continued meeting. After Matthew disappeared, Lydia had been hidden from most of Red Willow. Months later, Eli heard that she had given birth. Harlan told everyone the child died. Eli never believed it. Mara felt Noah move closer beside her. The old ranch hand remembered something else. Thomas Ellison had come looking for him shortly before his fatal fall. Thomas had asked about Matthew, Lydia, and a child who might still be alive. Eli had refused to speak then because he feared Harlan. Now he looked ashamed of the silence. Thomas had been following the same trail Mara was following. Sheriff Pike finally had a witness linking the dead clerk's investigation to Matthew Hart and the Voss family. But they still lacked the one thing that could overturn Harlan's documents completely. Original proof. As they prepared to leave, Eli noticed the brass key Mara had placed beside the papers. He picked it up slowly. Then he asked where she had found it. Mara told him about the schoolhouse. Eli stared at Caleb. The key had never belonged to a desk or county cabinet. Years earlier, Matthew had kept a small iron chest hidden in the loft above Cedar Ridge's old tack room. Eli had helped him lift it there after Harlan began searching his belongings. Caleb had lived on that ranch almost his entire life. He had never known the chest existed. By sunset, they were riding back toward Cedar Ridge with the brass key wrapped in Mara's hand. For the first time, the truth was no longer only behind them. It was waiting at home. The old tack room stood at the far end of Cedar Ridge, half hidden behind the main barn. Caleb had used it since boyhood, yet the narrow ladder leading to the loft had never seemed important until that evening. He climbed first. Mara followed with the brass key wrapped in her palm, while Noah waited below beside Sheriff Pike and Eli Mercer. Dust lay thick beneath the rafters. Broken harness pieces, empty grain sacks, and a cracked saddle frame filled the loft. Caleb searched along the back wall until Eli called up and told him to look beneath the loose floorboards near the western beam. There, under years of dirt, Caleb found an iron ring. He pulled. A section of flooring lifted, revealing a small black chest. Mara felt the weight of the key before she even touched the lock. It turned smoothly. Inside were bundles of letters tied with faded cord, a marriage record, several ranch documents, and a narrow leather book bearing Matthew Hart's name. Caleb sat down on the dusty floor. For years, his brother had existed only as regret. Now Matthew's handwriting lay in his hands. Mara opened the marriage record first. Matthew Hart had legally married Lydia Voss 3 years before his disappearance. The witnesses were listed. The county stamp was genuine. The date matched one of the letters hidden in the chest. Then came the letters. Matthew wrote that Harlan had refused to accept the marriage. Lydia had been threatened with losing her inheritance if she remained with him. Matthew also wrote that whatever happened, he would never transfer his share of Cedar Ridge to Harlan Voss or any company controlled by him. The next letter changed everything. Lydia was expecting a child. Caleb read the page twice. Below the loft, Noah remained silent. Mara turned to Thomas Ellison's burned notes. The fragments finally made sense beside Matthew's records. Thomas had discovered that a transfer giving Matthew's interest in Cedar Ridge to Harlan had been filed after Matthew's death. Someone had used a dead man's name. More records followed. Harlan had later presented himself as guardian of Lydia's surviving child. Through that guardianship, he could control any property the boy inherited until adulthood. The false freight charges, stolen cattle, and pressure on Cedar Ridge had served one purpose. Harlan had been weakening the ranch year after year, so the remaining Hart property could eventually be bought for almost nothing. But one question remained. Why had Noah been inside Ash Creek Schoolhouse? For the first time, the boy answered enough to complete the trail. Before Lydia died, she had given him the silver button and the brass key. She told him that if he was ever frightened or taken somewhere he did not trust, he must find a place belonging to the Hart family. Years passed before Noah understood what she meant. Then, on the night of the fire, someone delivered a message telling him that Mara Ellison knew where his father's family could be found. Mara received a separate message claiming Thomas had hidden evidence inside the same schoolhouse. They had both been sent there. Mara looked at Sheriff Pike. The fire was no longer an accident that happened around them. Someone had drawn them into the building together. Noah had carried the key. Mara had carried Thomas's remaining notes. If both disappeared in the flames, the connection between Matthew Hart, Lydia Voss, Cedar Ridge, and Harlan's forged papers could disappear with them. The truth settled over the loft with terrible simplicity. Noah was Matthew Hart's son. He was Caleb's nephew, and he was the lawful heir to Matthew's share of Cedar Ridge. Caleb descended the ladder slowly. When he reached the floor, Noah stood very still, as though afraid the truth might make him unwanted again. Caleb did not rush toward him. He simply knelt until they were at the same height. For the first time since the schoolhouse burned, Noah moved before anyone asked him to. He crossed the space between them. Mara turned away for a moment, giving them the privacy of something that had taken years to return. But Sheriff Pike had no time to let the discovery remain private. Harlan had already filed papers to seize part of Cedar Ridge the following morning. If they wanted to stop him, the chest, the marriage record, Thomas's notes, Eli's testimony, and the false guardianship order would all have to be presented in public. By sunrise, Red Willow would hear the name Harlan Voss had tried to erase. Noah, Matthew Hart. By mid-morning, nearly half of Red Willow had gathered outside the county office. Harlan Voss arrived as though the outcome had already been decided. His lawyer carried the papers meant to place part of Cedar Ridge under temporary control. For years, money, reputation, and fear had allowed Harlan to speak first and be questioned last. That morning, Mara Ellison stood where everyone could see her. Caleb remained several steps behind. He did not speak for her. Sheriff Pike stopped the property proceeding before Harlan's lawyer could finish. On the table beside him lay the scorched satchel, the guardianship order, Matthew Hart's letters, Lydia's marriage record, Cedar Ridge freight invoices, Thomas Ellison's damaged notes, and the papers recovered from the iron chest. Mara began with the simplest inconsistency. The document claiming Matthew Hart had transferred his share of Cedar Ridge to Harlan placed Matthew near Red Willow on a date when other records showed him hundreds of miles away. His signature had been copied with unnatural care, and his private letters stated clearly that he had no intention of selling his interest to Voss. Then Mara placed the guardianship paper beside an authentic county record. The seal on Harlan's document belonged to a design introduced years after the date printed on the page. A clerk from the records office confirmed it. The crowd grew quieter. Mara moved to the freight accounts. Cedar Ridge had been charged repeatedly for shipments that never occurred. Sheriff Pike had already documented 2 missing calves discovered among livestock prepared for shipment under the Voss name. The hidden identification marks were recorded before the animals disappeared. Harlan could dismiss one mistake. He could not dismiss a pattern. Eli Mercer stepped forward next. He confirmed Matthew's relationship with Lydia Voss, Harlan's opposition to their marriage, and the existence of the child Harlan later claimed had died. He also confirmed that Thomas Ellison had questioned him about the same events shortly before Thomas's fatal fall. Then Sheriff Pike opened the marriage record recovered from Matthew's chest. Matthew Hart and Lydia Voss had been legally married. Noah was their son. The boy Harlan had controlled through a questionable guardianship order was not an unwanted child with nowhere to belong. He was Caleb Hart's nephew and the lawful heir to Matthew's interest in Cedar Ridge. For the first time, Harlan's confidence broke in front of the people who had always feared it. He accused Mara of manufacturing evidence, but the accusation came too late. The county clerk verified the marriage entry. Matthew's letters matched documents already held in local archives. The iron chest had been found on Hart property in the presence of witnesses. Thomas's notes contained references to records filed long before Mara ever arrived at Cedar Ridge. Even the paper itself betrayed Harlan. One of the documents he relied upon had been produced on county stock issued after the date it supposedly bore. The truth no longer depended on whether Red Willow liked Mara. It existed without permission. Sheriff Pike suspended Harlan's guardianship claim, halted the seizure of Cedar Ridge, and ordered an investigation into document fraud, livestock theft, witness intimidation, and the Ash Creek fire. Thomas Ellison's name was formally removed from the accusation that he had stolen county money. His hidden work showed something very different. He had been gathering evidence. Mara stood silently as the same townspeople who had once crossed the street to avoid her lowered their eyes. She did not ask them to apologize. She no longer needed their judgment to decide who she was. If you believe patience, courage, and proof can be stronger than money and reputation, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Save the video and subscribe if you want more stories where the truth is allowed to finish what fear tried to silence. When the crowd finally dispersed, Caleb found Mara standing alone beside the courthouse steps. Noah was safe. Thomas's name was clean. Cedar Ridge was no longer under threat. For the first time in months, Mara had nothing left to run from, and that meant she was free to leave. The first snow came quietly to Cedar Ridge, 3 weeks after Harlan Voss was taken away for questioning. It covered the pasture in a thin white sheet, softened the wagon tracks, and made the ranch look untouched by everything that had nearly destroyed it. Noah remained at Cedar Ridge while the county completed the legal transfer of Matthew Hart's share. The boy changed quickly once he no longer expected someone to take him away. He slept through the night. He laughed around the horses. He followed Caleb from barn to corral, with the solemn determination of a child learning what it meant to belong somewhere. The ranch changed too. The false freight charges had stopped, the missing cattle had been recovered, and the winter accounts finally showed what Cedar Ridge could become without someone quietly bleeding it dry. Mara had changed most of all. Red Willow offered her a position assisting the county clerk. It was steady work, respectable work, and enough money for her to rent a small house of her own. Months earlier, she would have considered such an offer a miracle. Caleb never asked her to refuse it. He made certain she understood that Cedar Ridge was not another debt she had to repay. If she chose Red Willow, he would help move her belongings there. If she chose another town, he would take her to the station himself. The door he had opened for her would never become a lock. That freedom gave Mara the answer. She did not stay because she was afraid to leave. She stayed because the ranch had become the first place where her usefulness was respected without being demanded as payment for kindness. She continued keeping the books and insisted on earning her place beside every other person who worked the land. Caleb accepted the condition without argument. Their affection remained in small things. A second cup of coffee waited beside the morning ledgers. A repaired coat hung near the stove. 2 lamps burned in rooms that had once gone dark early because no one had reason to remain awake. One evening, Mara stood on the porch watching Caleb close the barn while Noah carried an empty feed bucket behind him. The boy stopped near the gate. For a long moment, he seemed uncertain. Then the name finally came. "Pa." Caleb remained still beneath the falling snow before turning toward him. Mara watched the two of them walk back toward the house together and understood that none of them had been rescued in the way people in Red Willow might tell the story. They had simply been given the chance to choose one another. Cedar Ridge became home long before Mara was free to stay. It became home the day someone opened the door without asking what she was worth.